So, hi everyone again. My name is Roxy, and I'm the Visitor Experience and Outreach Coordinator at the Lewis Latimer House Museum here, and I'm wearing a purple and green floral shirt tonight, and I'm joined by our facilitator of the ReVer Lab series, Sherese Francis. And before we start tonight's program, I want to acknowledge that the Lewis Latimer House Museum is located in Flushing, Queens, and is on the land of the Matinecock Nation, which are of the Algonquin people. They're the Aboriginal occupants of northwestern Long Island, among the first to feel the impact of European settlement, and seldom mentioned after the colonial period. The Matinecocks experienced profound changes after the 17th century. To learn more about the Matinecock Nation, we encourage you to visit their website and Facebook page that I'll now share in the chat. So I hope everyone can see that. I would also like to take a minute again to introduce the museum. The Lewis Latimer House Museum was home to Black inventor Lewis Latimer. He lived in Flushing specifically from 1903 to 1928. And his most notable invention is the carbon filament light bulb, which basically helps to make electricity and light accessible in everyday households. Along with that, we are here tonight for the fourth session of the ReVer Lab series. As part of Sherese Francis' poetic project KwaNTum, ReVer Lab is an invitation for participants to be part of her here research process over the course of several lab sessions and an open performance/collection. KwaNTum is a poetic project exploring concepts of knowledge and knowledge making through Afro-diasporic-centered research, looking at various Black and Afro-diasporic thinkers, writers, poets, and artists, as well as themes from STEM. Sherese will present research findings and work in process and invite participants, all of you here today, to create their own response pieces. Our program tonight is made possible by the literary grant with the New York State Council on the Arts and Queens Council on the Arts. This is one of several sessions, as I mentioned. There will be an in-person performance gathering for December, which participants are invited to take part in with their own writings. This workshop is call and response. The response could be for after Sherese's presentation today, but it is also building towards the performance response in December. Please feel free to take time to write during and after the presentation. We also want to acknowledge that silence is a very valid response, and we hope this resonates with you. Tonight's session will be on our architecture, touch, and text. And the description of the workshop is what I'm about to read. What if we rethink of common sense as community sense? How does relationship and sense of relationship affect how we know? How do embodied networks of the self operate? What does skin reveal about knowledge? Inspired by Octavia Butler's practice of primitive hypertext, we will explore how relationships of touch create knowledge systems and structures. And with all of that out of the way, I'm happy to introduce our facilitator tonight. Sherese Francis is an alchemist of the imagination and expresses herself through poetry, interdisciplinary arts, workshop facilitation, editing, and literary curation. Her work takes inspiration from her Afro-Caribbean heritage, Barbados and Dominica, and studies in Afrofuturism and Black speculative arts, mythology, and etymology. Some of her work has been published in Fierce Flower, Obsidian, Apex Magazine, among other publications. Additionally, Sherese has published 3 chapbooks: Lucy's Bones Grows, Variations on Selling Seedling, and Recycling a Why That Rules Over My Sacred Light. So I'll now pass it on to Sherese.
Thank you, Roxy, and thank you to everyone joining tonight. Tonight we'll be talking about, as Roxy mentioned, architecture, touch, and text. And I will share my screen now for the presentation. So architecture, touch, and text. I hope everyone can see the screen in the presentation. As a writer, touch is extremely important to me. A lot of people think writing is only about our thoughts, and and our voices, but I feel that writing is also a tactile experience. We're often using our hands to write. So I often think about the relationship between text and writing, as well as touch, architecture, and technology. So in thinking about that, I wanted to present this artist named Alexandria Aregbu, who is an Igbo American artist and works with cloth. And her work helped me think about how we can think of touch in relationship to fabricating time and space and connection, and using fabric as a way of connecting through time and space and a kind of technology. And this quote is from Alexandria, in which she says, "I believe that cloth functions like a vessel. Cloth holds invaluable threads of intelligence, like an inscribed memory, or perhaps like DNA. My work is an obsession with that information, memory, whether it be embodied, lived, or dreamt. I am frequently cross-examining my understanding of the natural world through sensory-driven concerns, often with a burning and enraged desire to fully interrogate the ancestral histories and traditions that were both stolen and kept secret from me." And what I really liked about this quote is that Alexandria connects fabric and thread and cloth through not just tactile experience, but also in thinking about science through intelligence and memory and DNA and information. And when she mentions these, it does make me think of the internet and the web. And I wanted to also bring in some of her work that she did. This was from the Ecology, Ancestral Healing, and Visual Art, a conversation with Alexandria Regbu and Dr. Chelsea McHale Fraser. And Alexandria mentioned these quilts that were made by Nancy Petway and Ella Mae Irby, and how they reference the housetop symbol that is from Igbo culture that she's from in West Africa. And at the top right, you can see the reference to the housetop in Igbo fabric making, and how through the reference that is in the quilt, you can see how symbols cross time and space from West Africa to the Americas, and how we can see that traveling of symbols in fabric and texture shows a kind of touch that goes across time and space. And to show more of Alexandria's work, it made me think of the other word that's used for touch, which is haptics, and haptic communication and technology, which I consider a way of accessing inner temples of knowledge. And why I say it's accessing inner temples of knowledge is because of the relationship between haptics and its etymology, which has to do with architecture. Haptics comes from the word apse, which is a semicircular extension at the end of a church. And it can also mean an arch or a vault, or the parts of a wheel that are fastened together. And the other spelling of apses, APSES, you see different definitions. One having to do with architecture, as I mentioned, the two halves of a wheel, and the arch or vault in a building. It could also mean the bishop's seat or throne in ancient churches. It could be a reliquary or a case in which relics of saints were kept. And then the last one, it had to do with astronomy, where it was the nearest and furthest points to the center of gravitational attraction for a body in orbit. And when I hear the last definition for astronomy,
Yes. Oh, you don't kick off this room. Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry for the disconnection. I believe we have an internet issue here. So I'm working with Sherese right now. Can everyone hear me? I'm sorry about that. I think Sherese will be joining us again in a few minutes. Yeah, we're working out of I can actually show you guys. Let's see. So I'm actually at the museum, like I mentioned, and we have a little Wi-Fi situation here, unfortunately, from before. Thank you all so much for your patience. So in the meantime, yeah, I believe Sherese is back on.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for that. I didn't realize I was kicked off of the Zoom. I guess I should, thank you, Suzanne. I guess I should restart the presentation because I was talking and I didn't realize that I was no longer in the Zoom. Um, So as I mentioned before, as a writer, touch and text are important for me because I see writing as a tactile experience, and I relate it to a form of technology, and a kind of ancient technology that has continued into today. And I brought up the artist Alexandria Aregbu and her belief that cloth acts like a vessel. Cloth holds invaluable threads of intelligence, like an inscribed memory, or perhaps more like DNA. She says, my work is an obsession with information, memory, whether it be embodied, lived, or dreamt. I'm frequently cross-examining my understanding of the natural world through sensory-driven, often with the burning and enraged desire to fully interrogate the ancestral histories and traditions that were both stolen and kept secret from me. So in her quote, she talks about cloth as a kind of encoding vessel that holds information, that holds memory, and she talks about both sensory and as well as a kind of technology. And in a conversation she had with Dr. Chelsea McHale Fraser, she called Ecology, Ancestral Healing, and Visual Art. She talked about these quilts made by Nancy Petway and Ella Mae Irby, and how they reference the housetop symbol that was once used in Igbo culture as well, that you can see at the top right. And in thinking about how symbols and writing and words can travel across time and space, much like how fabrics connect things together as well. And in thinking about how fabric and textile work are precursors to our modern day thinking about the internet and the web. And I mentioned that the other word for touch is also haptics, and haptic communication and technology are about accessing these inner temples of knowledge, especially when you look up the etymology of haptics and how haptics relates to architecture, the semicircular extension at the end of a church, also the apsis, which was an arch or a vault, or the two halves of a wheel. And other meanings of apses was the bishop's seat of the throne in ancient churches, also a reliquary, which was a case that held relics of saints that were kept. And in astronomy, it's the nearest and furthest points to the center of gravitational attraction for a body in orbit. And that definition also makes me think of entanglement, where you have two far points that are still connected to one another. So in thinking of haptics and touch, you can see relationships to arches and architecture, the ark or altars. Since it's reliquaries, you have archives as well. As I mentioned, entanglements, because of the wheel, you have circularity, which is an important idea in African diasporic culture. And of course, you have temples and churches and religion, which its own etymology means to connect back or tie back. And of course, churches and temples originally were kind of like observatories as well. And then of course, like all of this information connects back to kind of how we can think of physics in a different way as well. And the piece that you see at the right is from Alexandra Regbu, and it's called Allah, Chi, and Eke Lived Under the Same Roof, or If Heaven Was Home. So in thinking about touch and technology and architecture and text, I wanted to reference Lauren Olomina, the main character from Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And this is from Olamina's Earth Seed religion that she creates in the book. I think it's also interesting that she creates this religion as a character who has hyper empathy syndrome. And her hyper empathy syndrome basically allows her to be affected by the feelings of other people. She can feel their sadness, their pain, their joy, and she's easily affected by that. And so I think it's interesting the connection between the hyper empathy syndrome she has and her creation of this religion. And in thinking about that quote, I also wanted to bring up Octavia Butler's quote of every story I create creates me, I write to create myself. And so that kind of relates back to Lauren Olomina's own statement of the touch as you're creating also creates you and changes you. So in thinking about that and in thinking about hypertext, I want to bring up Octavia Butler's quote in conversation with Martin Delaney, in which she talks about hypertext. She says, I generally have 4 or 5 books open around the house. I live alone, I can do this. And they're not books on the same subject. They don't relate to each other in any particular way. And the ideas they present bounce off one another. And I like this effect. I also listen to audiobooks, and I'll go out for a morning walk with tapes from 2 very different audiobooks and let those ideas bounce off of each other, simmer, reproduce in some odd way, so that I come up with ideas that I might not have come up with if I had simply stuck to one book until I was done with it and then gone and picked up another. So I guess in that way, I'm using a kind of primitive hypertext. And in this quote, Butler speaks to how she lets texts, in a sense, touch one another, and it becomes this kind of generative process by having things that don't necessarily relate to one another find connections that they wouldn't expect to have. And she calls this a kind of primitive hypertext, which shows you how a lot of technology we have today comes from naturally how our social creativity works in general. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about textile work later on. So in thinking about that, I want to bring up this question of what do you let touch each other? What do you let touch you? What do you touch? What is rewritten in the touching? And thinking about that, I bring it to Anansi's digitation. Anansi is a trickster character from the diaspora who is known as the god of a character of wisdom, and is seen as a spider who creates a web. So in thinking about Anansi as this god of wisdom who's a spider who creates a web, you see the connections of Anansi to the current idea of the internet and the idea of connection and information and wisdom. So the idea of hypertext and hypertouch, and how through touch we create these kind of sensory connections and community sense. and these network systems of sense or knowledge. And another interesting thing is the word taste itself also means touch. So connecting more to how touch is this kind of all-encompassing sensory and also connects to other things like text and technology, since they all have the same etymological root as well. And how these textures of language and these slight differences of language also help to rewrite our systems as well. So in thinking about touch, I wanted to bring up how we currently use touch screens and thinking about how our realities are kind of like touch screens as well. And this kind of liquidity of touch and how touch allows for the plasticity or the ability to shape and mold our neural systems. And I mentioned here that we write with our hands, and I thought it was interesting that for many artists, hands are one of the hardest parts of our bodies to draw because they're so fluid in movement, and that kind of fluidity that is associated with being able to create with our hands. And that touch itself allows for this dissolution of the hierarchy of the mind over the body, because the skin is the largest organ of our body that covers our body, and it encompasses all the other sensory organs that we have as well. So in thinking about the body and sense and touch, I wanted to think about field notes with fields being spelled differently, F-E-L-D. And what happens when we let texts float between each other in the mass of text that exists, what new knowledges are learned and rewrite us. And those texts don't have to be texts in the sense that we think of text. It could be also texts that are in our body, much in the way that Alexandria talks about DNA. And this is a quote from Camila Janan Rashad about Octavia Butler's hypertext process. It means that as she creates material, she's reading into one thing, listening to this other thing, and floating passively between lots of different registers. This process is generative to her because it then allows her to create something that intimately connects different things that you may not imagine being related. So in thinking about touch once again and hypertext and this process of letting things that are not necessarily related somehow find a relation to one another, it made me think of skin in general, how we use skin to represent this idea of relation, but maybe we can think of skin in a different sense outside of just this visual of connection and more of connection through touch. So I decided to play on the word science and skin and fuse them together into a word called science, and thinking about expanding skin as a network system of knowledge. We gather information through our bodies, through our skin. As I mentioned, skin is the largest organ that encompasses our body. It's part of the integumentary system, which means that it covers our body, as well as the somatosensory system, which is the perception of touch. But skin also shows that our body is a kind of resonant membrane. And in thinking of that, it made me think of what other bodies have skin as well. And I think of the drum and how skin is used on the drum, and how we use our own skins to make contact with the drum as well. And in that play between our fingers and the skin of the drum, our fingers shape the instrument and the instrument is shaping us. Another question I ask are what others that have skin exist, and you can come up with some for yourself. Also, percussion as well is a medical field. It was the idea of the doctor listening to the body by tapping on the skin or shaking the body like a rattle and then listening to the body. So the idea of the skin also being related to medicine as well and sound as well. And our textiles, as I mentioned before, become a kind of another skin or web we wear, a web encoded with other informations like the quilts I mentioned that are coded and quilts that were used for enslaved people to find freedom. And in thinking about writing, again, in the previous session, I mentioned the word addiction. And the word addiction, the diction part being related to both writing as well as the visual side of showing something, and how writing as a kind of text and textile and that motions of writing mimic weaving and that creation of and the use of touch that helps us to create this kind of visible form of something. And last, I wanted to mention Audre Lorde's The Erotic and James Baldwin's Sensuality, and how we can use these ideas mentioned by Lorde and Baldwin to think of science differently, and how we can infuse embodiment into science as well and expand our field of knowledges. So in thinking about touch and technology, I wanted to bring up a word that I thought about last year called obsolutions. And it's a fusion of obsolete and solutions. And in thinking about how we can look to past technologies to kind of have a source material to think about present and future technologies that we have right now. And we'll talk about that more with Mary Baraka's piece on technology and ethos. But I wanted to think about obsolete technology of touch. Playing again. Obsolete technology of touch as a kind of slowing down of touch, since so much of our technology right now is about moving so fast. How about thinking about technologies that allow us to be slow? And looking at past technologies to think broader about technology in general. So I wanted to bring up this figure named Onesimus. And Onesimus was an enslaved man in the 18th century. And he was known for bringing the knowledge of inoculations to the Americas. And the word inoculations comes from the idea of implanting a bud into a plant. So you're grafting a bud onto another plant, and its etymology means to see within. And that relates to what I was thinking about, the idea of accessing inner knowledges as well, but also the idea of grafting being related to writing, but also the idea of technology as well as weaving, allowing for a connection and fabrication across time and space because of a bud being implanted into another plant. And in thinking about inoculations, I also relate it to cultivation practices because it has to do with plants, as well as ancient practices of scarification and tattooing, which often were used as ways of providing inoculations as well. So during the smallpox epidemic of 1721, Onesimus had suggested a possible way to keep people from getting sick to the Puritan minister who owned him, Cotton Mather. And Wanzimus, who was considered a rebellious figure to Mather, told Mather about an operation he had undergone in Africa. The operation Wanzimus referred to consisted of rubbing pus from an infected person into an open wound on the arm. This was done in a controlled manner and under the supervision of a physician, so the symptoms would be milder but still confer immunity. Once the infected material was introduced into the body, the person who underwent the procedure was inoculated against smallpox. It wasn't a vaccination, which involves exposure to a less dangerous virus to provoke immunity, but it did activate the recipient's immune response and protected against the disease most of the time. But the Puritans' fear of Africans and African culture, which they vilified, made them reluctant to try this new knowledge that Mather had learned from Wanzimus. A local newspaper called the New England Current ridiculed Mather. An explosive device was thrown to his windows with angry notes. There was an ugly racial element to his anger. Religion also contributed. Other preachers argued that it was against God's will to expose his creature to dangerous diseases. And that was from the History Channel. But as you can see, in the Puritans' fear of African cultures, there was a resistance to the kind of like intermingling of various knowledges and that fear of other kinds of knowledge, although this was an ancient practice that had been done in other cultures. But Wanzimus' story of inoculation is also a kind of grafting of itself, of how ancient knowledges can be applied in new spaces and move from one culture to another. And this information that I got from Royal Society, French geographer Charles-Marie de la Condamine stated that many West Africans had been practicing smallpox inoculation since temps immemorial. The transatlantic slave trade violently dispersed West African communities throughout the Americas, where they continued and shared their medical practices, including with their enslavers. The paucity of archival sources does not enable us to fully grasp the extent to which enslaved or free medical practitioners of African descent practiced inoculation in the Americas before the early 18th century. However, a handful of surviving accounts suggest that they were practicing it without European physicians' oversight or knowledge by the turn of the 18th century. So in thinking about Wanzimus being this enslaved man who brought knowledges of inoculation from West Africa to the Americas, I thought about the relationship between the robotic and the aesthetic, and how that relates to how slavery relates to artificial intelligence and this kind of outsourcing of human bodily experience and touch. And the word robotic originally came from the word a forced worker or forced labor, and the word for slave in general. But it was also the idea of an orphan, and the word orphan itself meaning someone who passes from one status to another. And to me, it shows the connection between slavery and information that gets passed from one culture to another through this process of enslavement, and how slavery is a precursor to robotics and artificial intelligence, which is creating, conditioning, or programming these machine bodies or machinery through dehumanization, oppression, and exploitation of organic and inorganic life to do heavier labor for convenience and comfort. And how our conception of technology has become this form of exploitation of labor and not this relationship with other beings, which is often called animism. And currently with technology, it's called techno-animism. So in thinking about the story of Wanzimus and robotics and the aesthetic, how can we think of our relationship to text and technology and touch differently? How can we, our relationship be more about touch? How we touch materials, how those materials touch us, and how we respond to each other's presences. And in expanding our idea of what artificial technology is to the aesthetic or a community sense of knowledge, much like in traditional mystic spiritual ritual societies and wisdoms like Vodun, Santeria, Ubuntu, which focus on the harmonious, relational, changing, or alternative states of being, like in spirit possession, dance ritual, and weaving, and seeing them as the origins of computer technology. So in bringing up weaving again and Anansi's digitation, seeing weaving cultures as a precursor to the digital. And this is from Notes on Weaving Digital Thinkers at the Loom by Teshome H. Gabriel and Fabian Wagnuster. And Teshome H. Gabriel was an Ethiopian American scholar. Our interest here is to explore new ways of thinking the relationship between modern digital technology and the traditional practices of weaving. From the perspectives of forward-looking technology idealism, this link might seem weak indeed. Traditional weaving, we are told, is something that belongs to the past, a past that technology is helping to put definitively behind us. We have been led to believe that letting go of backwardly traditional modes of production and imagination is an integral first step into the universal future of technology. We have to let go of our attachment to those outdated ways of doing things, we are told, if we are to become a part of the developed world. In what follows, we suggest that digital technologies need not to be understood according to the paradigms of the industries and interests that produce and promote them. Contrary to the conventional ways of seeing digital technologies, there are real and vital connections, structural, aesthetic, even spiritual connections between older ways of weaving reality and newer ways that tend to emphasize independence and innovation above all else. Rethinking the relationships between technology and weaving not only would lend traditional non-Western cultures a way of integrating digital technology into their own lives and value systems, it will allow us to glimpse the unacknowledged demons from the past that continue to haunt the digital revolution. And more from Notes on Weaving Digital. Weaving is digital in the sense that it relies on digits, on fingers for its production. Digits understood in this way tend to emphasize the sensory and more particularly the tactile aspects of technology and of culture per se. Thus, the digital involves a palpable relationality between the producer, product, and culture. Digits imply a connection, a tactile lived connection to a wide array of cultural meanings, woven by the community as a whole and handed from one generation to the next. So here Teshome mentions how weaving and as a precursor to the digital is about connection and that idea of community sense. And in fact, despite the newness often attributed to computer technology, much of its vocabulary, as well as of the internet, draws on relational concepts borrowed from backstrap weaving. Terms such as texture, pattern, layering, links, nodes, sampling, net, network, web, web weaver, and threads belong to a lexicon employed in both weaving and computing. On structural level, they both rely on the crossing interweaving lines, aesthetically and conceptually too. There are similar cross-thread mechanisms at work. The origins of the computer have in fact always been connected to weaving. The first machines were merely extensions of looms, and computers the extensions of mechanized looms. And I'll stop reading there and I'll let you all read later on when I share the PDF. But as you can see, Teshome is saying how weaving and recognizing the influence of weaving on technology and digital technology and computers can allow us to see computer technology and our relationship to technology different. And in thinking about the idea of the internet and webs and how we wear cloths on our body. Tashome says, traditional people wear what they themselves have produced. Their clothes and other textiles emerge from and reveal an intricate social fabric that communicates who they are, their ethnicities, nationalities, histories, and how they work and live. The fabric they weave and wear is a fabric of memory, of communal identity, of their connection to the rest of humanity. Weaving as a practice is a matter of linkage, a connectedness that extends the boundaries of the individual. This sense of open-ended connection and interrelation is precisely what Western notions of technology, in their instrumentality and emphasis on the individual, tend to repudiate. Yet, as the metaphors of weaving indicate, computer technology also opens up the possibility of a digital weaving that acknowledges this sense of connection. And once again, it brings it back to the idea that community sense and this kind of community thinking around the digital can show us how the origins of the internet already existed within our social societies. So bringing it back to Amiri Baraka and the expression writer or haptic communication, which is accessing archives of knowledge. Amiri Baraka talks about in Technology and Ethos how machines, as Norbert Wiener said, are an extension of their inventor creators. That is not simple once you think. Machines, the entire technology of the West is just that, the technology of the West. Nothing has to look or function the way it does. The West man's freedom unscientifically got at the expense of the rest of the world's people has allowed him to expand his mind, spread his sensibility wherever it can go, and so shape the world and its powerful artifact engines. Political power is also the power to create, not only what you will, but to be free to go wherever you can go, mentally, physically as well. Black creation powered by the Black ethos, brings very special results. Think of yourself, Black creator, freed of European restraint, which first means the restraint of self-determined mind development. Think what would be the results of the unfettered blood inventor, creator, and the resources of a nation behind him. To imagine, to think, to construct, to energize. And I wanted to go down to where he mentions the idea of the expression writer. A typewriter, why should it only make use of the tips of the fingers as a contact points of flowing multi-directional creativity? If I invented a word placing machine, an expression scriber, if you will, then I would have a kind of instrument into which I could step and sit or sprawl or hang and use not only my fingers to make words, express feelings, but elbows, feet, head, behind, and all the sounds I wanted, screams, grunts, taps, itches, I'd have magnetically recorded at the same time and translated into word, or perhaps even the final expressed thought, feeling, word, not even merely word or sheet, but in self, the expression, three-dimensional, able to be touched or tasted or felt or entered or heard or carried like a speaking, singing, constantly communicating charm. A typewriter is corny. And I thought that was funny, but in thinking about touch and, as I mentioned before, science and its relationship to skin, why do we have writing technology that is only about our fingers when it could be about its relationship to our entire bodies would be an interesting thing. And we're currently creating technologies like that with like dance technologies that use computer technology as well. But the fact that Amiri Baraka was thinking about this in the 70s is shows you how if we can access and credit different ways of thinking from different cultures, what kind of technologies would we be able to achieve and create outside of the ones that we have now? And in thinking about that, as I mentioned before, with science or science as a means of accessing embodied archives of knowledge. And Amiri Baraka mentions this as spirit. And I think of spirit being related to those embodied ways of knowing. And in thinking about that, thinking about how sensation and sensitivity, and thinking about Lauren Olumina and her hyper empathy, how that's been politicized as well. And thinking about sensational flesh from Amber Jamila Musser and the idea of textured beings. Through sensation, we gain access to how structures act upon bodies. Though each body reacts differently, we can read a structure as a form with multiple incarnations and many different affects. All of this is achieved without having to mass appeal to identity. This is about opening paths to difference. So how is our flesh revealing the flash of the spirit? Knowledge is carried across space and time that still affect us, carried all across the diaspora. Our current and speculative creations woven together that show all the ways we've been touched. What does it mean to be effective, to be a sensitive, sentient body? And this is from Kara Keeling's Looking for M, Queer Temporality, Black Political Possibility, and Poetry from the Future. This formulation of affect and affectivity is important because it underscores the extent to which our efforts to assimilate that which moves us are bound to the ethico-political context of our times and available to capital and its normative structures of command, as well as to related yet distinct operations we know as racism, homophobia, misogyny, and transphobia, among others. At the same time, it points towards the ways that whatever escapes recognition, whatever escapes meaning and valuation, exists as an impossible possibility within our shared reality. However, that reality is described theoretically and therefore threatens to unsettle, if not destroy, the common senses on which that reality relies for its coherence as such. I understand Marx's phrase, poetry from the future, as a way to mark just such an impossible possibility. It is a form of poetry that is associated with lyricism and fragmentation and temporal from the future, disruption, which functions primarily at the level of affect in ways that resist narration and qualitative description. It is a felt presence of the unknowable, the content of which exceeds its expression and therefore points towards a different epistemological, if not ontological and empirical regime. So in that quote from Kara Keeling, how do we think of different sensitivities of various bodies and whose senses are not included in our kind of community sense that is constructed? And sensation, sensitivity, sentience, and power have always been entangled. We can think of this in scientific racism of figures like Christoph Meiners, who presented a theory that Black people have thicker nerves and so we're less sensitive, and thus Black pain has been seen as less significant than other races, and how that has influenced the medical field and how Black people receive treatment. So in thinking about entanglements across time and space, how can we use text and technology and touch to think about the different ways we sense, the different ways we feel, especially across time and space? And I'm thinking about like African Fractals by Ron E. Glash, in which he mentions the different kind of text technologies that we have and the different rhythmic sensitivities that we have in textile weaving and braiding, which had helped enslaved Africans find freedom through encoding in quilts and putting seeds in our hair, or even masquerade rituals all across the diaspora, like Carnival in the Caribbean, where my family is from, and how all of this influences our neural and textual plasticity, that kind of molding and changing of ourselves. So our Science remembers because our science was shaped by those marks into our memory. And this quote from Isabel Gibbons, a cook enslaved by two University of Virginia professors who then became a teacher after emancipation. Can we forget the crack of the whip, the cowhide, the whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten those horrible creatures, hundreds of our race killed? No, we have not, nor ever will. So in thinking of Anansi's digitation and the idea of wisdom and memory, and how our skins hold information much like an internet or a web of a computer. And in thinking about the effect of the whip, the vibration, the web, the wave, the haptic, the HepiCat, what we know, and what we know being affected by the shaping of our skin, the ship that transverses an ocean of memory. What the ship touches at each port, it wears the science of its arrival. Trade routes, trade rhythms, trade rights. And then from Frantz Fanon, why not quite simple attempt to touch the other, to feel the other, to explain the other to myself? Was my freedom not given to me then in order to build the world of the you? At the conclusion of this study, I want the world to recognize with me the open door of every consciousness. My final prayer, oh my body, make of me always a man who questions. And how can we allow touch to be a way to let our bodies be these porous bodies of knowledge and create new sciences, or a body made of questions. And this poem from Amy Césaire. Twist yourself, wind round my new growth, touch my space fingers. I give you my conscience and its rhythm of flesh. I give you the flames that char my weakness. I give you the chain gang. I give you the swamp. I give you the interest with the three-cornered journey. Devour wind. I give you my rugged lips, devour and twist yourself. And twisting claps me in a greater shiver. Embrace me into the fury of us, embrace us, but biting us as well into the blood of our blood bitten embrace. My purity has no bond but your purity, but then embrace like a field of measured phileos, the evening of our many colored purities, and bind me without remorse, bind me with your great arms to the glowing clay, bind my black vibration to the very navel of the world, bind me, bitter brotherhood, then strangling me with your lasso of stars, rise, dove. So in reading that poem from Amy Césaire, which was from Frantz Fanon's Black Skins, White Mask, I think about Anansi's digitation and the idea of Anansi's web that allows for these various sensitivities and vibrations and fractaling of ourselves that, as Amy Césaire says, allows for our many colored purities and this kind of porous body of knowledge. So in responding to Césaire's piece, I wrote a draft of this poem called Griot's Nagara Divergence. And Nagara is a word in Mali Mande language that is musical mastery of the griot, which is a bard-like person, storyteller in Mali Mande, West African culture. So Griot Nagara Divergence, instrumentation and impressions. The more I play, the more I become my own Ngada, within my own gravity, writing a syncopated entanglement, suspended pitter patterns of touch and no touch, touch and no touch, the sound of we exist together, swinging ships between points, expanding, vibrating walls, edges. We are pressed together, come, touch. Touch's definition is an illusion. Crick, crack, each kneading fractal adds color to our jam. Threads pulled into connection. We nub, come, compression, compassion, computer, fabricated in a big pot, big foot, big feed, big field, a collection of self. Time exists in my science and my mind has been touched, but I nub, what do you nub? And can you dig it all? Fingers and toes pressing, searching within the ground of the body to root the seeds of my plant thoughts. Wander, I am, buried as an encoded in trees to share what I nub, branching yet I am possessed and possessor as code, as a ship, as a drum, my hands immersed in the computer, the tension, refraction, reflection, bending, warping, the gravities made by my hands, even when unlit, unnamed, but compacted through the weight of history onto a calabash head, doubled, mirrored, and flashing light. So to end the session today, I want to share my architecture prompt. How does the compression feel in the ship? What textures of being exist there? How do we rethink digital fabrications of time and space there? Feeling your way through the dark of the ship. And I provided some art resources that you can use as a beginning to think about this prompt. First, Beat Jazz by Onyx Ashanti. He created this exoskeleton that he wears and that generates sound through movement. And he has a self-programmed language called Metabit. So I provided some videos and an essay that references beat jazz that you can look into. I also included Ketly Noel's dance that she did at Lupola Retreat recently, in which she is dancing on the ground and creating these kind of writings on the ground with the dirt that she's using, that she's also covering with her body. I think it's an interesting way to think about textiles as well as writing in relation to one another. And I will post this in the chat. And then the next one is one of my favorite books is Midnight Robber by Nalo Hopkinson. And Midnight Robber is about this character named Tan, who's a little girl who lives in this privileged kind of corporatized Caribbean society of Toussaint, but is then abducted by her father and taken away to this underworld of the New Halfway Tree. And there's a figure in the story named Grand Nanotech Sentient Interface, or Grand Nancy's Web, and it's an artificial intelligence that guides and controls the people of Toussaint, but also ends up following Tan through New Halfway Tree and becomes this kind of guardian for her throughout the story as she explores this kind of masquerade of folkloric influence world of New Halfway Tree. And what is interesting in the story is the nanny code that is used for Grand Nancy's Web becomes nanny songs in New Halfway Tree. And so it changes from this kind of written code to an oral code in New Halfway Tree, and how technology can shape and shift depending on the spaces and locations that it finds itself in. So in thinking of the relationship between Granny Nanny, who also influences the name of the artificial intelligence, and Granny Nanny was a maroon in Jamaica's history. So the connection to maroonage and fugitivity, ancestral knowledge, or as I call it, goads, gods and codes together, and resisting fixed surveillance through textured technologies and histories. So textured technologies being different kind of applications of sciences, like the changing of myths throughout history, myth versioning, oral cultures, play mas, which is the term used for masquerading in carnival culture. And the other term I came up with was narrative plasticity. So the allowing of these kind of data and information to change and shape shift depending on the applications that are needed. And I posted a link to a book where you can read a little bit more about the story as well. And I asked this last question of how can a tech drum's body become an instrument or application of new sciences, reprogramming computing interfaces into new forms or textures? So I'll post that into the chat as well. And then I'll give you about 10 minutes to reflect and write. And then we can end with a share out of whatever you write in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and share what you've been thinking about as well. Okay, it's not letting me post. So for some reason, I can't post this one, but I will leave it up here for you to reflect on during the next 10 minutes. Feel free to keep writing or processing in any way you've chosen to. I just want to share some of what has been written in the chat. First, let me stop share. Terrence mentioned that cloth was very important in the African American experience. Many things, objects were folded and saved in cloth materials. Even my grandmother, who was a seamstress, did so. Yes. And Terrence also mentioned, reminds me of indigo. Yes, and indigo was an important dye, blue dye that's used in throughout the diaspora, especially in Yoruba culture. And it was, the blue was in connection with calming the spirit. And it's medicinal and spiritual connections throughout the diaspora. So yeah, indigo was an important part of textile work in Yoruba culture in West Africa and in the South, like in South Carolina cultures as well. And Terrence also mentioned that advanced African medical practice goes all the way back to ancient Kemet, Imhotep. Yes, there's a lot of ancient traditions and knowledges throughout Africa that has influenced the rest of the world that isn't talked about a lot. And I think it'd be great to explore that more. And Terrence said, reaping what is sown, wearable technology, and more. Yes, and thank you, Terrence. And I will definitely thank you for sharing your information. I will contact you later on as well. Simone mentioned that they love the narrative plasticity. That's a whole meditation. Yeah, so if you write something in response to that, please share later. Terrence mentioned, more so than this information, I want to know what is my background that produced this. I like to research a lot of things, and I don't research through like normal stuff. Like everything is information and research for me. So I pull from a lot of places, and then I kind of like this session weave them together into a theory, as I think the bell hooks talked about creating your own theories. Simone said, I just want to say, looking at Simone Lee's Loophole of Retreat makes me want to rest it alongside Black Quantum Futurism Prime Meridian Conference. Black Quantum Futurism was also at Loophole of Retreat. They were there during day 2, I think. So you definitely watch their performance for that. Terrence said this could have only come from one's ancestors, history, and parents, and the process of making indigo involving hands. Right. So like our hands being involved in all of these kind of processes, and how ancestral knowledge, history, even our parents, all of that is information that gets passed down. So I want this as a way to expand our ideas of what is information, what is encoded information, because we tend to think it's only computers, but it's also our own bodies as well. We're encoding information that has been passed down for centuries. And Simone said she'll think about it some more, and I definitely look forward to reading or viewing whatever comes from your exploration. And thank you for coming. And if anybody wants to unmute and share vocally, please do as well before we end tonight's session.
So obviously, thank you. You did more than just great job is not the words for it. I want you to speak on, your whole talk makes me want to also ask you to speak on more of the ancestral, where that comes from. It's kind of, it's woven throughout your talk. And so if you can speak more, if you can, on that personally, in terms of not only maybe producing this kind of material, but also in terms of the work itself. I think you did speak a little bit about how things are passed down, but that ancestral spirit being very, very important to knowledge. There's different, like you alluded to or mentioned, there's different types of knowledge. And I was being honest, 6 decades of being on 2 continents and hearing tons and tons of lectures and talk. This has been the deepest.
Oh, thank you, Terrence. Well, a lot of my practice is, as you've seen through this series, is somatic based, and I use a lot of kind of sensory connection to determine like what knowledges to go after. So I'm the type of person who doesn't rely on what people give me to study. I go search for it often, and I'm also someone who believes in synchronicities. So oftentimes it feels like sometimes the knowledge gets presented to me just out of nowhere. I'll see a book, and like I mentioned about Anansi and the spider web, and how the spider web is about feeling vibrations when something touches it. I sometimes feel the vibrations of like knowledges kind of coming together and helping me in this kind of process work of this. And I think a lot of how I see things comes from my Caribbean heritage. My mom's from Barbados, my dad's from Dominica in the Caribbean. And so a lot of how I view things is through that kind of that spiritual cultures that are found in the Caribbean, like Haitian Vodou or Santeria, or kind of spiritual Baptist in Trinidad, or these kind of cultures that are more than just about this kind of objective view of knowledge and science, but are more about this kind of sensory cultures as a way of tapping into different kind of knowledges that exist. And that knowledge isn't just this kind of Western idea of how we think of knowledge. That knowledge exists around in the atmosphere, and our bodies kind of tap into those different knowledges. And a lot of that influences how I see science and technology. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. I can relate to that. I know where you're coming from. I don't want to take up anyone else's time, but real quick, if I can come back and ask, I know this is a very narrow-minded question, but I have to ask, your top 3 or 4 favorite artists.
Oh, wow. There's a lot. Well, one of my favorite musical artists is Parliament Funkadelic. I like how they not just their music, but also their lyrics, and how they kind of infuse various sources and materials into their work. And that kind of fusions and experimentations with their work is very influential in how I process art and work as well. So they're one of my top influences. In terms of other artists, Janelle Monáe currently, and how she creates with her own kind of myth making, and this android character is influencing how I think about my current project as well. As I mentioned, Octavia Butler and Nalo Hopkinson as writers, how they think about kind of different ways of thinking about science and technology through diasporic cultural thinking as well. Yeah, and those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head currently right now. Fela, I love Fela as well. There's also, I might bring him up in the next session because he thought about the relationship between like language and magic as well, and that connection to science that might be interesting as well. So maybe we'll talk about him in the next session as well. So, but thank you for mentioning Fela. And Suzanne mentioned, this is the place I long to always be, not where ease is damned behind walls of disease, but where an ever-present soothing calm dances on the air and I sway gently to its rhythm. That is beautiful. Thank you, Suzanne. If anybody else would like to share anything before we close out, feel free to. If not, I would like to thank you all for joining me.
I can ask one last question since no one else is. To knowledge, to presenting all this information, to art and so forth. It's not an off-beaten question, but I believe it's related, and you might think so too. How important would you say diet is to this kind of information and producing this kind of information and thinking and the way you say you learn?
You said diet?
Yes.
DIET? Well, in the previous session, I did talk about taste and smell, and how what we feed into our bodies also affects knowledge as well. So I think all of it is related, that how we create and make knowledge is related to that process of how we digest things and ingest things as well. So I think it's extremely important. Yeah, because what we digest into our minds is also related to what we digest into the rest of our bodies. So I do think it's important. So if there are no other comments, I thank you all for joining tonight's session, and I hope to see you all in the next session. And Roxy, if you have anything else you'd like to add.
No, just that I'm so sorry, Terrence, for cutting you off. Yeah, just to share that the next session will be on the second Wednesday of the month. So I shared that registration link, or just to check it out on our website in the chat. We'll also be sending out a video recording of tonight's session, and you can check out other sessions if you missed those. But yeah, that's all, and thank you all so much for joining.
Dupe.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.